Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you are keeping healthy and safe. Welcome to part one of our morning research morning seminars, sponsored by our friends over at UCOM. I'm Dominic Tilson. I will be the host of today. I'm the head of industry initiatives at the IAB, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. Just as a bit of housekeeping, all of the attendees will be on mute, but hopefully you're familiar with Zoom. There is some Q&A functionality at the bottom of your pages. If you want to ask any questions, our team will be moderating them. And if we have time at the end, we'll hopefully be able to answer some of your questions. So bear with us. Today, we're going to start off by hearing from Julie over at UCOM. Jennifer at LinkedIn will be showcasing some great insights. They've done the largest ever analysis into B2B video creative. And you're in luck, you're getting two Dominics for the price of one today, as Dominic Satter from Flash Talking will be talking about some key learnings they've gained from Firefox and Safari on how they can plan for a cookieless future with Chrome. So I'm going to hand over now to Julie Foray. She's the Director of Insights over at UCOM, and she will be giving you an update on the latest insights and particular focus on the impact of COVID-19. So over to you, Julie. We'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Dom. I'm just going to share my screen. That this is working. Can everyone see everything? Okay. I'm assuming that's a yes. Okay, so good morning, and I hope you're all well. What I'm going to run through today is the impact of COVID-19 on online usage. What you've probably noticed is that I've actually got my video off, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, because my broadband's not great. Secondly, the camera is right at the bottom of my screen. I didn't really want you to see up my nose. And also I've got two small children, and so you won't see me shooing them away if they decide to gate crash this. So for those of you who don't know what UCOM is, UCOM stands for UK Online Measurement. We are an industry body responsible for ensuring there's a credible, independent third-party measurement of what people are doing online across PCs, tablets, and mobile devices. Just, I didn't realise that IAB was going to put a photo up of me. So just so that you can see who I am, given that I'm not on video, that's me. And if you've been to any of these seminars in person, you'll have seen me before. Because we're the sponsor, we get to be at every one. Now, UCOM is owned by the industry, is bar AOP, IAB, and we have the IPL on our board. And our partner, our data partner, until the end of this year is Comscore. And as you can see from all the data that I'm going to be presenting today, you'll see that there's a lot of Comscore data. And I am going to share with you quite a lot, because I'm going through a lot of categories. So apologies, it's not going to look pretty. There's a lot of data, but it's more about information rather than, I guess, imagery, if you like. Because I've got a lot of stuff, the IAB have kindly given me two parts, and it's also because we're the sponsor and I'm at every one. So part one will be today, and part two, I think most of you will be on the call next Tuesday at the second part. So when my kind of 15-20 minutes is up, I will just carry on next week. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? So just to start off with, I'm going to compare January data this year with March. Few reasons. The months have got the same number of days in, which is always good if you're comparing things like minutes, but also I didn't want to compare with last March because every year Comscore enhanced the methodology. So for like purposes in terms of methodology, I'm comparing with January, but I do take into account, I have looked at sort of where it's the impact may be due to seasonal as opposed to the impact of COVID. So I've looked at what would have happened last January to March 2019. I'm not showing that, but just to kind of ensure that what I'm showing you is a real trend as opposed to just a seasonal change from Jan to March. So remember as well that lockdown only occurred on the 23rd of March. So this really is including only 1 week of lockdown data, when we were at home, but we were already seeing huge changes in behaviour. For example, people were working from home more in March already, people were panic buying, the Premier League was postponed. I think the last game was on the 9th of March. And then there was that very much publicised Liverpool game on the 11th of March. So really kind of sport had almost come to an end. The Cheltenham Festival ended the 19th of March. So we've got really sort of 2 or 3 weeks data when I think behaviour was really starting to change. So just looking at March, we will expect, though, bigger increases and changes for April, and obviously we'll update this when the March data comes, April data comes out, sorry. So, I mean, the reason also I'm looking at March is because Comscore data that we have is monthly. So we've got March data at the moment, and April obviously hasn't quite finished. So what we're looking at is time online. If you look at the actual time that people spent online, we saw a bit of an increase, 8% across the board, slightly more amongst older and very younger. I had a quick look to see where that uplift may have been coming from for older people in particular. Tended to be, no surprises, grocery, retail, health, and also IM. See an increase in video chat. We'll talk about all these categories later. Maybe they're actually chatting with their kids who are 18 to 24. That's kind of just an assumption. But there are increases across the board in terms of time spent. That said, even though 55 saw a slightly higher than average increase, they still spend much less time online than older people. So overall, if you put that increase into minutes, it equated to around about an extra 17 minutes that people were spending on average online in March compared to January. Obviously, this is only people who are online. We know that internet penetration is lower for older audiences anyway. So that's nearly 3 hours is of those people who actually use the internet. That's 3 hours per day. I'm now going to look at categories and delve into some a little bit more detail. So to start off with, just to give a bit of a snapshot, I'm going to show all the, if you're familiar with Comscore, which I'm sure many of you are, I'm going to show all their major categories. This is the percentage change in unique visitors between January and March. It's always always a bit nervous about looking at just percentage change because some categories are smaller than others, so you can see big changes in uplift. You're looking at a category, they're all a pretty decent size. It's not looking at just one or two individual brands. What we can see from this is that government, education and health showed the biggest percentage increases. Family and youth was also up. That seems to be driven mainly by Disney. But categories witnessing big declines are real estate, which is property, maps, people like stopped traveling, stopped going out in their cars, automotive, I guess people aren't looking to necessarily buy a car when they're concerned about their financial situation going forward. Massive decline in some travel categories. Travel as a whole, you can see there, is down 2.6, but we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. Now, I mentioned seasonality before. The fact that categories like automotive and gambling are down at all is quite remarkable because normally between January and March, they both show an increase. So for example, last year, gambling was up 7% between Jan and March. This year, it's down 2%. So that's like a 10% swing. Retail as a whole, you'll see when you just look at percentage increase and things like news shows minimal growth. And that's because when you're looking at the whole category, pretty much everybody always goes to shops online or goes to a retail category or a news category anyway. So they're almost at 100%. So you're not going to really see much of an increase in unique visitors. And for that reason, and also with retail, there are huge variations within retail in terms of different types of retail. And for that reason, I'm looking at next slide, looks at actual numbers of people in terms of millions. And I've included both the subcategories and the major categories. So this gives an idea, not just looking at percentage increase, but which categories are attracting more people between January and March, or actually have lost people. What you can see from this is that it's the news categories, the subcategories where really people are visiting. So these, when I'm saying categories, I'm talking about websites and apps. I can't look at like particular articles on a type of site. This is literally looking at the classification of the sites. But if you are a politics section within a newspaper, you will be classified as within the news politics. So we have over 7 million extra visitors for news around politics and for business news and also technology news. So those subdivisions of news really attracting more people because of the nature of COVID. We're also seeing some of the ones before that you've seen government, an additional 5.6 million. And that's where when you look on those ones on the left, you'll see that food and supermarket and grocery retail is in there, an additional 2.6 million. This is just in March. As I say, don't forget that lockdown only happened on the 23rd of March. People already starting to wonder how they're going to get their food. And as I said before, slightly higher amongst those who are older, probably more likely to be isolating. So saw a big increase there. Gaming information is predominantly Twitch. Health I've mentioned before. So some real increases. And when we look at decreases, I guess no real surprises, similar to what we saw in terms of the percentage, but you can really see how travel dominates it. So online travel agents, minus 6.1 million. Travel information is really TripAdvisor. Then you've got the hotels and home sharings like Airbnb, Booking.com, all seeing massive decreases. These are much bigger decreases than you would normally see from Jan to March. Obviously, travel normally peaks a little bit in January anyway, but these are really, really huge decreases. Property again, tickets. So in terms of retail, there was two categories that I think, suffered a little bit more than others. That is ticketing, quite obvious really. People aren't going to be wanting to go to events if they're not on, and clothing retail. Interesting listening to the radio this morning to hear that Next has suffered huge losses in the last quarter. We saw visitors down to their online site by 20%. So some unfortunate stories there. And also, I mentioned before, maps. Now, because I don't want to be too negative, most of what I'm going to go through today later on is going to be showing the categories that have grown. But obviously, I could go into detail in terms of all of those categories that have declined as well. I wanted also to look at time online. It's important that it's not just looking at unique visitors, because some categories, particularly like news and instant messenger, as I said before, have already got huge penetrations. You can see there are some differences. I'll pick them out. B2B is predominantly driven by MS Teams. We saw video chat really quite high. But you'll see instant messenger and news, the time spent up by over 30% or 28–30% there. So a huge number of minutes added in March compared to January. Again, the ones that we've seen decline, pretty similar to before. The one I wanted to point out was sports. So even though sports unique visitors didn't really go down, we saw a massive decrease in the time spent on sports sites. So quite obvious, people may have visited them in the early month, or actually just interested to know what's happening with the fixtures and stuff. But ultimately, in terms of the amount of time spent, that's either viewing sports or content, was down by almost 40% in March compared to January. In terms of what that equates to in minutes, again, no real surprises, but for sports, that's a decrease of 1.4, that's billion minutes. If you look at the title, it's millions. So the ones that are really showing an increase are social networking, instant messenger, and all news. We saw some real big increases there in terms of time online, and the other one's quite obvious in terms of grocery that we saw before. So I'm now going to get as far as I can in this part to go through some of the categories that are gone up, either time online or unique visitors, where we've seen some big changes since January. And they are grocery, retail, food retail, news, social networking, IM, and I've also added in video chat there. And then probably next week, if I can get through those 4 today, and if I don't, we'll carry on next week, government, health, education, and touch on entertainment, although probably not as big increase as we saw, as we would expect. So first of all, looking at retail food, overall there, just snapshot why I'm including the category, because we saw visitors up, we saw minutes up. Really the kind of main thing to look at is these were the main grocery retailers, and all of them saw increases. So these are really big increases, no real surprises. Actually, one of the things I didn't say is most of the data that I'm showing you is really intuitive. There's probably no real surprises. Everything kind of backs up what you would expect. It's always good when the data that we have does show trends that you would expect, and there's no real kind of unusual things happening. Obviously, most of these had dedicated shopping hours for the elderly, vulnerable, and NHS workers. So even those ones like Lidl and Aldi that weren't necessarily doing online deliveries at the beginning of the month, people were still visiting them, I guess, to find out more about when their opening hours are, what they were offering for them. So you see a huge increase. I think Morrison's started doing online delivery, and these constantly changing. So a real increase in visits to food and grocery retailers. I also looked at kind of some of the bigger food brands, the food delivery brands, and interestingly, they also benefited from lockdown. It's particularly those food delivery services, so Just Eat, Uber Eats, and Deliveroo all saw increases in unique visitors. Unfortunately, the high street restaurants like KFC, McDonald's are all down. That's because they all closed. They don't do online delivery anyway through their own brands, but you could in the past buy them through Just Eats and Deliveroo. And I think just this week they've announced that they are looking to do delivery service again, and some of them are reopening, and they're kind of testing things at the moment with NHS deliveries and what they can do with their restaurants in terms of drive-through. So they're kind of slowly working out a way in which they can get back in operation. So it'll be interesting to see that, but that probably won't come through until May data. I thought I'd also add in a few other food retailers, because we did see some increases in some smaller brands, things like Muscle Food, whose strapline is healthy living for all. They're a food delivery service. So people were looking at alternatives. They couldn't necessarily get in to get their normal food delivered. Milk and More is as it suggests. They deliver dairy, eggs, veg, bakery, and mainly milk. But they had such unprecedented volume of new customers trying to join that they had to close their site to acceptance for new registration so that they could service their existing customers. And you can see some of the other ones there that people were starting to look at. So a much bigger range. These are just a few that I selected. There's so much more information I could go on to in terms of time spent and different audiences, but this is a snapshot on who's up and who's down. The next category I thought I'd look at is news and information. We saw a huge increase in minutes, 28%. People who did visit news site, which is pretty much everyone, they were spending an extra 103 minutes in the month of March. And as I said before, we saw big increases in different types of news. So these are the top 10 news properties according to Comscore, or news groups, if you like. And you can see again that they all increased. Sky News quite phenomenally almost doubled in terms of its unique visitors from 16.6 to 32.1. This is all basically, if you know, it's online only, so it's tablets, PCs, and mobile phones. So you can see they're all increasing, and it is the what we call the qualities. When I come on to, I'll come on to that later actually. When I look at the newspapers, but one of the things I think was interesting is that people are consuming more news, as I said before, from a wide range of sources. When you look at those subcategories, and you've seen them before in terms of the fast-growing categories, you see business and finance news, the visits are up, the minutes are up, politics news, it's up, technology news is up as well. So it's not just your daily newspapers, it's a wide variety of different publications, which I'll show you on the next few slides. And I think we're seeing that predominantly, I think, because of aggregator sites and Facebook, the increased distribution of news from different publications. So Apple News was also up between January and March, as was Samsung's Update news aggregator. Quickly moving on, I'm realizing time, I might be going over, might only get through two categories. This is just looking at online daily newspapers. So whereas before you saw kind of the news groups, so things like Reach, this is splitting it out. So you've got the Mirror and the Express, all the individual main titles. I also included I know they're local, but the Metro and Standard, because I think it'd be interesting for the audience. And you can see that they're all up. It's the qualities all experience more than 25% growth in visitors, but all of the newspapers online saw an increase in visitors. What I said before in terms of business and finance news, I'm whizzing through these. It's really, you don't have to look at each individual point, but it's really just to get an idea to show you how much more news we are consuming. This is looking at business and finance news, and you can see things like Forbes, Reuters. People are looking, this is Money FT, huge increases across the board in terms of visitors as people are reading about the virus, the impact that it's having on the economy, on business, and so forth. And then again, politics news as well. I thought what's quite interesting is now we see a massive increase in people consuming global content. I've handpicked some of the publications there. A lot of the US news brands, a lot of people now consuming content around what's happening in the US. But it's not solely just US. I mean, if I look down the list, you'll see increase in things like Al Jazeera. So generally people are being exposed to a lot more global news. Yes, predominantly they've had that opportunity through greater distribution and access than ever before. But certainly at this time, the time of the virus, there is a real interest and desire to read stuff from a wide variety of publications, including a lot of kind of science and technology publications as well, where again, an additional 4 million adults are visiting technology sites, that's plus 13%. Obviously, we keep hearing from the government in the UK, it's all about the science, it's all about the science. And I think people are increasingly reading articles around the science and technology around the virus. I just wanted to throw this in here. I mean, this isn't in the Comscore's news section, but I saw a huge, started to notice that there was an increasing use of credible sources what I've termed credible sources and official stats. Apologies if you disagree with me. I think one of the most interesting was the increase in usage of worldometers. Now, I don't know if anyone has seen this, but it's gone from almost 0 to 10 million unique visitors in a month. They have basically live statistics and coronavirus news tracking the number of confirmed cases, recovered patients' tests, and death toll around the world. So you can compare how UK is doing with every other market. You can look at deaths per million population. If you love stats like me, then literally it's really, really interesting, and you can do all graphs and everything. So 10 million unique visitors in the UK have been accessing that site in March. Other ones as well that we've seen a growth is The Conversation, from 1 to 2.53 million. It's not small. That's an independent source which is written by academics and researchers. So it's supported by like most of the UK universities. They have other partners as well, but they're trying to be total transparent, and their funding doesn't in any way determine what they write about. So it's literally direct from the experts. That's how they position themselves. And Full Fact, that's an independent fact-checking charity. That's a bit of a mouthful. They provide free tools, information, advice, so you can check the claims that you can hear from politicians or the media. And obviously in this area of fake news, particularly really important that people understand that the right and wrong news around COVID, and you may well have got things delivered to you which says hold your breath and things like that, which they look at checking to see whether they're true or not. I may have time to go on social networking. I hope I'm not going to run over a little bit. I'm going probably a little bit over what I said, but social networking, whatever we don't do this week, we'll do next. Social networking, we did see an increase, but it tends to be an increase in time spent. What you can see here, I'm just looking at unique visitors for the top ones. Obviously, Facebook, Instagram already really high. Where we saw the more change in terms of unique visitors was in things like change.org and TikTok. So TikTok continues to increase. Obviously, children broke up from school or were forced not to go to school. So we're seeing a real increase there in about 3.5 million addition to ByteDance, which is TikTok's brand. And also Nextdoor, I mentioned this at the last research breakfast, showing how it was growing. That is a local neighborhood social networking site. I also wanted to look at this in terms of average minutes per visitor, because this is ranked in, well, this is shown in the order of size in terms of unique visitors. So Facebook is by far the huge. So even though it's only increased by 15%, that's an additional 77 minutes on average that people were spending on Facebook in the month of March. That's just Facebook, not Facebook Messenger. I think Facebook Live has probably driven some of that, and you can see some of the others as well. So increases pretty much across the board in terms of average time. I've got IM and video chat as well. Is Frankie on the call? Could I just do 1 minute on this one, or should I? Can she speak?
Yeah, go ahead. Do 1 more minute, no problem.
Okay, it'd be a good way to finish as I finish social. So IM and video chat. This is probably the most interesting out of all the categories. I guess grocery is one of the ones that grew massively, and news. But IM minutes were up by 32%, and people who used it were spending an average 149 minutes per month. Now, I've taken ComScore's IM category and I've added in a video chat. The reason I've added it is because at the moment in a ComScore, Zoom, I think, comes into technology, Microsoft Teams in business to business, and house parties in social media. So I thought it would be good, now that we're all using them, to keep in touch face to face. But it's good to put them into IM, because obviously things like Skype and WhatsApp have that ability anyway. So it's kind of a made up category by me by adding those, as you can see. So you won't find it on ComScore. But I think the really interesting thing here is you're looking at unique visitors, is what's happening to Zoom, as we're all well aware today. It's gone up from 0.7 to 6.7 million visitors in March, Microsoft Teams as well, and House Party. So really they've all increased. Messenger, Facebook, actually, that decrease, we're investigating that. We think it could be a data anomaly. So ignore that for now. I'll update it as soon as we get the latest figures. But what you can see is really huge increases. And normally 76% from Skype and Microsoft Teams would be huge in terms of visitors. But because of House Party and Zoom going through the roof, those bars on the right all look a little smaller because they're very squashed down. I've had to, a House Party would have gone off the chart. And then finally, looking at average minutes per visitor, because obviously this is really important. So Messenger, Facebook, up huge because it's the biggest, 674 minutes per month, people who are visiting. This is amongst visitors. That's a huge number of hours. And if you look again, increases across the board, Microsoft Teams up, House Party up as well. This is average minutes per visitor. I think Microsoft Teams doesn't have the, I think Zoom, people who are using Zoom, there's kind of a time limit on it for most people at home, which might be why that's not gone up quite as much as the others. Microsoft and House Party, obviously there's no time limit, so they seem to have gone up a little bit more in terms of average minutes spent. But you can see the differences in terms of growth and in terms of relative size for unique visitors and average minutes, which is why I wanted to show all three types of stats. That's pretty much it for now. Just to put those minutes into perspective, that's an extra 4 hours on Facebook Messenger, an extra hour on Microsoft Teams, 45 minutes on House Party, and 1.5 hours on WhatsApp amongst those people who use it. That's all from me for now. I'm going to carry on next week if this is interesting. I know there's loads of data in here. It was really about trying to show you, pick out some of the categories that have grown and really just show you across the board the impact that it's having. So by putting loads of brands, it just gives it a little bit more flavor that literally everyone is being impacted. They're either going up, or if I was going to show you some of those negative categories, you'd see a lot of brands going down, but we wanted to stay positive for this conference. That's it from me. Hope that's useful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julie. That's really, really insightful. It's great to see. And I think it's just worth reminding everyone that this only takes into account effectively 1 week of lockdown in the end of March. So it'd be really interesting to see what happens in April. Just a quick reminder, there is a Q&A capability at the bottom of the page if you want to ask Julie any specific questions. And also, as she mentioned, she'll be doing part 2 next week on Tuesday. So again, if you're interested in that, then obviously do let us know. I would like to now hand you over to Jennifer Bunting, who's the digital marketing leader over at LinkedIn, and she's going to be running through their largest ever analysis of B2B digital video created. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thanks, Dom, and hopefully everyone can see the slides. I'll just checking that before we go on. Cool. So thanks for the introduction. My name is Jen Bunting, and I am with LinkedIn. I lead product marketing for Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. And my team spends a lot of time across many different products at LinkedIn, but primarily we talk a lot about video. We get so many questions around how to best do video on LinkedIn specifically, especially after we launched our video ads product a few years ago. And as a product marketer, I really wanted to have a data-backed answer behind recommendations because creative can be so subjective. So that's why we created and embarked on an over 10-month process to do this analysis. So I'll walk through what the analysis was so you have a bit of understanding there. And then the goal is really to share 5 takeaways from the data that you can, if you're an agency, you can share this with your creative team or with your customers. And if you're on the brand side, this is really great. So you have a common understanding when you're working with creatives around the types of creative techniques that you can think about having in your, in your video ads. So let me just make sure I can advance the next slide. Awesome. So why did we do this when there is a ton of research already available about video best practices that's out there on the internet for free? So why we did this, because there is a bit of a difference for B2B and B2C. A lot of the recommendations that are out there are geared for B2C. And just as a really quick example, if you were to wait in line, if you were to go down to your corner shop and you really wanted to pick up a packet of crisps, your decision is not very expensive. It's very in the moment based on either maybe an ad you saw or just what sounds tasty to you at the moment. By contrast, if you are trying to make a decision for a technology, especially for your business to invest in, if I wanted to make a recommendation to my manager around an investment in products like Hootsuite versus Sprinkler, that would require an extensive analysis and business plan. I'd be asking for additional budget, so that might get flagged up to CFO type of people who aren't experts in my industry and why I need a particular piece of technology. I'd have to think about how the team gets trained and process and procurement and security, lots of things. So as you can see, the decision gets infinitely more complicated. Even though as marketers, we can be borrowing from the B2C playbook to make our ads stand out more, we really have to keep that psychology in mind. And that's what we saw really missing when we saw a lot of recommendations around keep your videos under 3 or 6 seconds. Didn't take that psychology into what the buyer would need to find. And so we started the research project. In order to do this, we wanted to have, as I said, a data-backed understanding of what the very best performance in video ads looks like. So we had access to 38,000 lines of creative that ran in 2018. We isolated this for EMEA, and then we did a further isolation on the very top performers. Of course, performance is a bit of a definition based on what your marketing objectives are. So video, like any ad format, can be used to do a lot of different marketing objectives. So we isolated for view-through rate, engagement rate, completion rate, and CTR, because each of these we thought may have different types of best practices in the creative. And then we wanted to isolate for that and give you really specific recommendations in terms of what you could do next. And we also took a human view at this. And I mean, I specifically watched over 260 videos frame by frame to really understand things that our dashboards at LinkedIn couldn't tell us. For example, content type. There's a big difference in thought leadership versus a product demo versus a case study. I had a very long list of content types. We tried to understand how audio was used or wasn't used and what could be going on in those individual video frames from a visual standpoint. Was it a close-up? Was it a shot of landscape? Was it a product shot? Were there motion graphics? Was it animation? The spreadsheet was very large, and so we really tried to understand how this fits from kind of a metric by metric standpoint. So I'll move into that now because we only have 20 minutes, but we'll be actually creating a lot of resources around this, so please stay tuned and follow our blog. We just finished filming a video mini-series right before COVID-19 lockdown that we're really looking forward to share with everyone in the future. So first question, how do you stand out in a B2B environment and get more views and have your video content really stand out? And also what not to do. That's often more helpful in some cases when trying to decide what your creative should look like. A lot of recommendations from different platforms and different video creators really focus on short micro content. And micro content, micro storytelling is important, but how you execute that really can make a difference. And what we see a lot of marketers do, because a lot of times your social video creative just ends up being a cut of a longer, maybe a television commercial. There's a huge influx of animated GIFs or GIFs. And I would just say the GIF is pretty much the equivalent on the internet of a blinking billboard, particularly for B2B. So as you can see in this example we made on the right, we didn't want to shame anyone because a lot of effort may have gone into some GIFs. This repetitive motion doesn't tell you anything if you're trying to make a big technology purchase or another purchase for your business. Meanwhile, you compare this to pharmaceutical company Bayer, out of, I believe, Switzerland. Really fantastic example of having short content. This ad had some of the highest view-through rates in EMEA in all of 2018, and they also had an insanely high click-through rate. They did some really brilliant things here to tell a micro story in around 6 or 7 seconds. They know LinkedIn audiences like information, but they put the stats and the copy around the ad. Instead, the visuals of the video itself are actually quite emotional. It's the story of what if a grandfather cannot see his own grandchild, and then what can Bayer by default do to help you avoid that situation and live better. This is a really great example of how you can tell a micro story very quickly and have a very memorable, memorable experience for your audience versus an animated GIF. Thinking about engagement. So one question I've gotten from our sales team is video the right format for driving engagement? And I would say without a doubt it is. When we look at our data, video ads earn 30% more comments per impression in our newsfeed than a non-video ad. An example of that would just be a static image ad, for example. So what can you do to drive conversation? The number one tip I would say is focus on people. This is a brilliant example by a company called SITA, and they had a piece of research on baggage tracking. Now, luggage or bag tracking could be a little bit dry, but they instead made it very human and relatable by talking about lost luggage. You may actually be missing lost luggage experiences since we're all locked at home right now, but in general, it's a pretty painful thing. They focused on a person, so they made it relatable by what they were talking about, and then the camera is really a still shot, one single shot of the speaker asking a few questions and explaining you can come and learn more from them. Really brilliant example for us in these times, especially when you may be needing to film a lot of content from home. You could easily do that type of shot and recreate it on an iPhone. And it also means you can save some of the video editing or production work budget and use it in other things like media distribution. So really brilliant example of how to do that, and focusing on those close-ups like you saw here really helps inspire conversation. The flip side of that, what if you don't want to do a close-up? This is a great example by Google in a case study for the Android. So if you think about what spurs conversation in another way is when things are relatable. So with a case study, think about how you can make the person feel like they are in the shoes of the main character or your protagonist that is being told in the story. Google did a great example of that with the Android and really spurred tons of conversation in the feed with those ads. And lastly, a totally different look and feel. As a product marketer, I was interested especially to see how were some product demos done on the platform. Booking.com for Business knows travel compliance is a very dry policy, and they wanted to showcase what their product and what their solution would be for that. So they took the human element out of it because it's a conversation that is also a bit technical, and they wanted to showcase in some of the examples you would have seen product shots and how to do it. But the main focus here is the animation. They took a dry topic and added a lot of color, movement, things to keep you visually interested in while addressing a key pain point. The pain point of how do you book travel for work and comply with your travel policy. So this is a great example of making it very digestible and easy to understand, and the nice color in the newsfeed always stands out. All right, let's talk about what clicks. Now, clicks are a love-hate topic for me. It can be a bit of a commoditization of the marketing function, but in the end, we always do get asked about clicks because it helps us understand page traffic that we're driving and getting closer to driving leads for the business. So we definitely wanted to understand what makes people click to your landing page from your video. Jabra, a technology company, in this case specifically talking about hardware and their headset, did a really fantastic example. Now, backstory, of course, basic marketing, but it's great to see it in examples here. So when you're trying to drive a click, you have to create some mystery. You can't give everything away in the ad. You need to give them a reason to go to your landing page. Jabra is an example of a B2B campaign where they were applying a tactic from the B2C playbook. Unboxing videos. I'm sure many of you have seen an unboxing video on Instagram and other channels, but very typically this is around products like makeup or a Nike shoe unboxing. Here they used this for unboxing on LinkedIn. This had some of the highest click-through rates in EMEA of all of 2018, and quite simply and elegantly done, starting off with the face to camera so you can relate to the person who's going to do the unboxing, and then a bit of mystery and teasing as they open the box and share with you what's inside and how you can use it as a business professional. And by the way, not many unboxing videos, so a bit of white space there that you can take advantage of. Excuse me. Moving on to an example from financial services. This is a bank out of Austria whose name I cannot even begin to pronounce because I only speak English, so I apologize that I'm not trying to speak German here. But that said, you don't need to speak German to understand what works really well with this ad. First of all, they captioned it in English, so that is a great help. Second of all, they created mystery with a thought leadership piece that really brought the user in. Number one, right off the bat, you would have noticed they faded in. They started it from a dark background and then brought light to it so that it kind of an unveiling or an opening of the curtain at a theater, for example. Also, the gentleman, the protagonist here on the screen, they're sitting in a very unusual way. It definitely caught attention. You wonder, why are they sitting this way? Lots of camera angles here, close-ups and then backup so you can see them. And then the topic itself was interesting. I was not expecting to necessarily read along with all of the different pieces of creative that I saw, but it really caught my attention and I wanted to learn more. And I was wishing they had more in English actually, so I could understand more about what they were talking about. So great example in terms of creating mystery from a thought leadership perspective. There are some other tactics outside of clicks, engagement, views that I think are really important for us to think about as marketers when we are trying to stand out in social. As Julie said, social engagement is up right now. That said, audio isn't necessarily the thing that people are listening to when they're watching your video. We know from our data that only 79% of videos are watched with the sound off. So a much smaller proportion with the sound on. Now, as marketers, we're of course spending our precious budget on things like licensing for songs and writing scripts and taking time to get the audio just right. So how do you use audio when no one is listening? And I particularly want to show you examples here because what I found frustrating as a marketer was there's all this advice around silent storytelling. But how do you actually do silent storytelling if you're not creating a movie in the 19-teens or 1920s? So here are two examples that were absolutely fantastic. Acciona is a bank out of Spain, and they used silence in a very poetic way. They actually paid quite a bit of money to license. I'm assuming they would have paid money. I don't know for sure, but they used a really fantastic song, Mad World, as the backdrop to this video creative. Their creative was all around making decisions from an investment portfolio perspective that really benefit the planet and what happens to our planet if we don't act responsibly. So a lot of the images were very emotional if you care about the environment and show the destruction that can be done to our planet. And rather than having a very dry voice explaining everything as a backdrop or voice of God, they actually just let the music play. There was no other audio. Now, knowing that 79% of audiences on LinkedIn do not listen to that, they very smartly captioned it or subtitled it with simply the lyrics from the song. So if you happen to know that particular song, then it could inspire you to give the video a listen. And even if you don't, lyrics are written in a very poetic way, so you can really take advantage of the fact that people weren't listening and get them to take action still. Another thing to take advantage of is facial expressions of your talent or your actors. Essity is a personal paper products company, I believe out of Switzerland, and they wanted to have a campaign that really talked about the importance of having tough conversations with your daughters. So it was a bit meta in terms of how they took a play here. The whole point of the ad is breaking through silence and having a discussion, but they actually didn't have any dialogue at all in this ad. It was completely silent. They relied entirely on the script for it to be physical. So the reactions on the expressions of the faces of the actors, the eye contact with each other, moving things around on the set. So they were really able to tell a silent story. And I would also say, and I know most of us are, that could potentially influence your completion rate. And what I would say is that, and was quite surprising to me, is the higher the completion rates, we're looking at the creme de la creme, the very top performers. The top performers across each category. And in completion rate, those top performers for completion rate often had far below, sometimes bottom out of EMEA in terms of performance on click-through rate, engagement rate. So you really need to think about how are you using completion rate to advance your goals with the campaign. It definitely has a role. Completion rate is absolutely fantastic for understanding, is your content sticky and do people stick around with you to hear your story? It's an indicator of relevance, and it's also super handy if you're going to use it as a retargeting tactic or tool later in your campaign journey for your audience. But on its own, in isolation, it can be a bit of a red herring. So really think about how is completion rate adding to your story. There are, of course, sometimes exceptions to the rule, but that is what we found in general. So I didn't actually find a good example of a lot of completion rate videos for you. However, what I tried to do is I looked for videos that had very high completion rate and another metric. And so I thought I would show you the one that had the highest completion rate plus the highest click-through rate. This is an example out of Abu Dhabi. It is a very targeted ad and very focused. So it's all about the right audience and the right message, really getting back to simple stuff we should be thinking about as marketers. So they were talking about an app that Abu Dhabi Global Markets offered for attorneys, so they could very easily target attorneys, and they really just featured focused on what that app looked like and what you would be able to get out of it if you were to install it. And I thought in the last few seconds we have left, I would tell you what not to do, because I also watched around 60 of the bottom performers to keep this really short and on time. One is homogeneous videos that have like a very long intro. You'd be surprised how many videos had really unique content, but because they were trying to adhere to branding guidelines, they might have wasted those first 3 to 5 seconds of video footage using a video they already, like an intro, like as if it was the opening to Friends or another TV show. Don't do that, because if you're retargeting, your audience will think they already saw it. It's better to have some sort of pop-up or motion graphic, some kind of layover so that people can get to the point right away. Make sure you're not overdoing it on text. I saw a lot of videos in the bottom performers that were really nothing more than very bullet point heavy slides and repeating what I said at the very beginning, full circle. Micro content, think about micro stories rather than micro in terms of time, and animated GIFs just simply do not work. And then lastly, if you want to take a screenshot of this slide, and I think a PDF will be sent around, here's a recap of the top 5 things. So you can share this with your teams so that they can have a think through them all. I'm going to just this is pretty much the last slide, I believe. So I'll just see if there was do we have time for questions if there are any?
Think if there's any questions, we've not seen any come through specifically
cool.
for you, so
all
we
right,
can
cool.
answer some stuff later.
All right, let's just check in. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Jen. That's really, really good to see, and it's great to see some parallels between the B2B and the B2C world. I'm always fascinated about how video can take into account that 80% of people are actually using or experiencing that content with the sound off. So those are some really, really good examples there. I'm now going to hand you guys over to Dominic Sata. He is the VP of Business Development from Europe in Flash Talking, and he's going to be talking to you guys about how we've learned some lessons from Safari and Firefox to help plan ahead for the obvious conversations we're having around Chrome. So Dominic, over to you.
Cool, thanks Dominic. I guess I'm Dom and you're Dominic for this part of the presentation. All right, I'm just going to share my screen, so do let me know if you can't see anything, because that would be a problem. You guys able to see that okay?
Looks good to me. If you want to go full screen, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Okay, marvelous. All right. Okay, cool. So I called this presentation The Other Browsers, Cookie Rejection in 2020. And I think so much is being said and written and spoken about at the moment regarding our cookieless future, and there's loads of technologies and loads of initiatives that are really looking forward to the days when third-party cookies are really no longer a viable option for personalization, targeting, and measurement, and all the other kind of mechanisms we use them for in digital marketing. But I want to take a little bit of a step back because cookies are still probably the default mechanism for a ton of advertisers for measurement right now. And what you don't often hear in the panels and discussions around cookieless futures is the situation right now. What's the actual impact today on my measurement mechanisms by using third-party cookies? And as Dominic said, what lessons can we learn from our experiences with browsers like Firefox and Safari that can hopefully better ready us for this cookieless future with which we're heading towards? I should say, my name's Dom. I head up biz dev at Flash Talking. In previous roles at the company, I set up our sales engineering division. So I've kind of done a little bit of everything over at Flash Talking. So forget Chrome for a second. What does cookie rejection look like today? The reason I wanted to do this presentation really was because there's probably a lot of people on the call who are gonna hang up and go back to their jobs, which is going to be putting campaigns live, maybe programmatic traders, planners who are going to be setting up new campaigns, marketing managers who are going to be deciding what direction their performance marketing is going to take in the next 6 to 12 months. So really, well, we should absolutely be having the conversation about Chrome. We should also be thinking about the here and now and what's going on with cookies at the moment. Kind of a bit of a boring base covering here. I never want to assume the folk on the call are all in ad ops or ad tech background. So what are cookies and what do we use them for? I wrote this really horrific 2 sentences last night attempting to define our use of cookies in ad tech. It's kind of quite ugly and messy, but I think it gets us part of the way there. So what is a cookie? It's just a text file that's stored locally on your machine. It's a browser level, it's not a device level identifier. What do we use it for in digital marketing? So we use it to try and give us a consistent view of the same person. And I use the term person very casually in 2020. What we mean by person is instance of a browser. So my version of Chrome versus your version of Chrome. But for shorthand, I'm going to say person with that caveat. So what do we use it for? We use it for remembering stuff. So we store things in a cookie. We store the products that someone might have looked at on a website for the purposes of showing them those products again in an ad. We store information about what they might have purchased on site, so we can hopefully tie that purchase back to previous ad exposures. And so really the main mechanisms of targeting and measurement are underpinned and have historically been underpinned by third-party cookies. The second use case is really the glue that sticks the kind of the programmatic ecosystem together. So all the things that are necessary to transact an impression programmatically historically were underpinned by third-party cookies. So for an SSP and a DSP to be on the same page, if you like, about a user, they have to sync cookie IDs so that the DSP knows what they're bidding on and the SSP can offer the impression with the correct data associated. So cookies have been pretty important in digital marketing. They still are, I think, again, despite what's said and written and spoken about, cookies still really are the currency for a lot of digital marketing. So I decided to add some questions into the presentation to hopefully increase user engagement. So the first one is coming now. Let me just work out how I launch the poll. Here we go. Question 1 is this. So what was the default policy in Safari relating to third-party cookies prior to ITP? I've realized that this is probably an overly technical question for number 1. Don't worry, the ones further on are a little bit more marketing friendly. And I should say as well, there's no grand prize for the winner. You just get the smug sense of self-satisfaction knowing that you knew the answers, which I think should be enough for anyone, quite honestly. Okay, I'm going to give everyone a few more seconds. I can see that 17 people have answered. I reckon the other people probably just are already watching Good Morning Britain or Loose Women and aren't paying attention. Okay, 5 more seconds and then we will end the poll. Boom. Okay, so the lion's share of the respondents got it right. So it was visited sites could set cookies, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we go on to the next slide. So it feels to me, anyway, like third-party cookies have been doomed from day one, if you like. Ever since I joined Flash Talking, there have been various events and scandals and controversies which have kind of led us to believe that third-party cookies were never going to be a long-term solution for our marketing efforts. I've kind of thrown out some of the more newsworthy stories in this slide. I think for me, the first thing I remember as being a really remarkable moment in the checkered history of third-party cookies was the zombie cookies scandal, which happened around 2009, 2010. For anyone that doesn't remember or wasn't in the industry at that point, what happened effectively was creative folk in ad tech realized that there were storage mechanisms in Flash, which were associated with the Flash player, which you could use to remember stuff. So similar to a browser cookie. But what was great about flash storage is it wasn't removed, obviously, when you deleted your browser cookies. So what was happening is folk were using flash as a storage mechanism to persist cookie IDs for cookies that got rejected. And the reason they were called zombie cookies effectively is because a cookie was effectively able to come back to life after it had been deleted because you persisted the ID via another mechanism. Big stink was made of it, understandably. It got almost to court. Everything was settled out of court in the end, but it involved some pretty high-profile companies within our space. I'm sure you can read about it still online if you're so inclined. The next thing I remember that kind of had everyone in a bit of a flap, who made their living off third-party cookie data, was when the browsers got together to launch the Do Not Track initiative. So this was going to be a signal in the browser header, which basically indicated whether or not a user was permitting companies, anyone, to track them or not. So really admirable initiative. It had cross-browser support. And at the time, this was 2012, it seems almost quaint saying it now, but Microsoft's browsers were the open web in the same way that the Chrome browser is today to a large degree. So the Microsoft browser, Internet Explorer, had the lion's share of web browsing. So what they decided, which was kind of a bit surprising, was they were going to have this signal, this Do Not Track signal, on by default. And everyone kind of raised their eyebrows a little bit, because it would have had the same effect in 2012, I should say, that the Chrome changes are likely to have when they come in. What was interesting was, I think it was less than 2 weeks after Microsoft made the announcement that they were going to have this on by default, they made a rather rapid U-turn. So all I can think is maybe there were some of the sales reps from MSN got on the phone and explained the fundamentals of database digital marketing to the guys at the browser, and a swift change was made. But again, I think there was a brief period when we all scratched our heads and thought we're probably going to need a new mechanism for measurement, because it looks like cookies could be going away. So one little footnote in relation to the question that I asked before this slide. So obviously, folk might be familiar with ITP, which is a product that WebKit have built, which is used by the Safari browser to prevent cross-domain tracking now. But before ITP, Safari's always had a very proactive policy when it comes to preventing cross-site tracking. And I think there was a misunderstanding before ITP that Safari blocked third-party cookies, and that was never really the case. It was more nuanced than that. What Safari used to do is allow sites you visited to set cookies. And you can imagine in their minds that made a ton of sense, because by visiting a website, if I visit Pepsi.com or the BBC.com, it implies some kind of relationship between me and that website, so they should be able to set and read cookies. The problem was that a site visit is not always as straightforward as that. So imagine that you clicked on a link which had 3 redirects in it, tracking redirects. Maybe one of them was flash talking, one of them was Kenshu, one of them was DoubleClick, for example. As part of a 302 redirect, you visit that domain. So those domains become visited in much the same way. So those platforms could set and read cookies. So the old Safari policy didn't really have much of a material impact on the really big ad tech companies. If you had, say, for example, I can't think of an example, you owned a massive search bid management platform, a publisher ad server, an agency side ad server, and a DSP all in the same domain, you only need one person once ever to click on a link, and you'd be able to set and read cookies from that domain across the web. So the old Safari policy, as admirable as it was, gave a leg up to the bigger platforms, and eccentric little English ad servers like Flash Talking at the time struggled a little bit because we didn't have the same footprint of cookies in Safari. It was interesting. It spawned a bunch of interesting creative workarounds from the ad tech community. So some companies would have click redirects hidden in accept buttons. So if you accepted terms and conditions or something, it redirected behind the scenes. Some companies just had a big chunk of JavaScript which did a redirect behind the scenes. Flash Talking, we weren't immune from coming up with creative solutions. Our solution was that we offered clients the ability to run our ad server on a first-party domain, effectively. So it's still done by a bunch of our clients today. So instead of clients running ad tags from our domain, they would reference a domain of theirs. So that was the old Safari policy. I think it sometimes gets forgotten today, where really Safari's thought process came from with ITP, and it was really to address some of the workarounds and solutions that folks found with the old visited sites policy. And then I think, you know, if you work in ad tech or digital marketing, unless you've been, you know, hiding under a rock and you managed to avoid it all, you'll have seen there have been some well-publicized changes in browser policy over the last couple of years. We've had ITP rolling out in Safari. We've had a very aggressive policy in Firefox around third-party cookies. And obviously, as has been in the trade press a lot recently, Chrome have signaled their intention to end all support for third-party cookies in the next 2 years. So, cookie rejection, what does it look like now? How's it impacting your data and your campaigns right now? I should say at this point, the reason that we're able to pull this data together is we acquired a probabilistic ID solution about 5 years ago, a German company called Device9. Our accuracy against truth sets is about 98%. And the reason it's so high is it's not a cross-device ID, it's just a more stable ID for a single given device. So that's why we're able to derive these insights, is we use that data as a truth set and see how often we see multiple cookie IDs against the same F-track ID. So cookie rejection in 2019, I think I've got another quiz question to ask now. Apologies, I can't work out how to ask the question without exiting my, oh, here we go, here it is. Let's go to question 2. I think I've just given the game away. I have, oh well. What was average cookie rejection by device in 2019? I think it's actually on the slide, isn't it, behind me? So there we go. I don't think I need to run this charade any longer, as I think you can all see the answer. So the correct answer, surprise, surprise, was 32%. So 32% of browsers able to accept cookies, rejecting them. So we aren't fudging the numbers here by adding a load of app traffic in here. This is all web browser based impressions. The more important number, in my opinion, is the second number, 64%. 64% is the number of people, the number of cookies that those 32% are rejecting. I'll try and illustrate that in a way that makes a little bit more sense. So imagine I'm one person. I use Safari, so I'm habitually rejecting third-party cookies by default. So I'm going to constitute 1 in that first number, in that 32%. Now imagine I see 5. And let's use flash talking as an example, but this will impact all vendors who use third-party cookies in the same way. Let's say I'm served 5 flash talking ads. Now, when an ad tech platform goes to set a cookie, you don't necessarily get a response or anything. You generate a unique cookie ID and you go to store it in the cookie in the user's browser. But obviously it's blocked, it's rejected. But we'll still log that cookie ID. And then what happens is 5 minutes later, we go to serve another ad and we think, oh, this person doesn't have a flash talking cookie. We'll give them one. So we generate a new cookie ID, go to save it, doesn't happen, we don't know. And that process repeats. So that means that this 32% of people, and again, I'm using people in speech marks, everyone knows I mean instances of a browser. These 32% instances of a browser are responsible for 64% of all the cookies that attempt to get set. Now, why is that important? Well, if you're using a log file, for example, to do kind of attribution, so you're looking at path analysis, path to conversion, multi-touch attribution, all of these things where you're trying to see a consistent view of the same customer for all their digital touch points. Using third-party cookies, 64% of the rows of data in that log file are misleading because they're implying to you that you found a new audience member, when actually all you found is someone who's rejecting cookies. So what's the practical impact at an aggregated level? So what we find, and again, this is data taken from 25 of our large advertisers who agreed to be part of the study, what we find is that you're missing conversions 41% of the time. So you're unable to associate an ad impression with a site conversion 41% of the time. So again, some maths there. If you think you generated 100k revenue in conversions or 100,000 conversions, you actually could have attributed 141,000. So that's going to impact your CPA quite significantly. And remember, what we're going to talk about in a minute is that cookie rejection isn't even. It's not equal for everyone. So it's going to impact some channels and some sites and some parts of your media more than others. So it's not a fair correction. What else do we find? We find that my laptop's frozen. Reach is overstated by 89%. So most platforms that are using third-party cookies simply add up unique cookies to calculate reach. Obviously, if you've got lots of one-and-done cookies in there, you're going to overestimate reach quite profoundly. So if you think you reached 10 million people, you actually only reached 5.3 million. And the other side of the same coin as reach is really frequency. So frequency is just how many times you serve those unique cookies an ad. So obviously, you're watering down frequency quite a lot because you've got all these one-and-done cookie IDs you're never going to see again. So you think you're serving a frequency of 10 per user, and it could actually be more like 15. And this is the overall picture from last year and how it changed from the year before. So the 2019 totals underplay the changes in Firefox that happened in Q3, where they blocked all cookies by default. So the totals for the year water down the impact of that a little bit. I've got some data on Q1 this year, which is going to show that in more detail. So what we've seen is around 3% year-on-year increase in cookie rejection. Interesting, if you look by advertiser, the majority of advertisers are seeing between 20 and 60% rejection, some as high as 60 to 80. And we're going to see why that's the case in the next slide. You can see that rejection differs by device type, as you'd expect, because certain browsers are more prevalent on certain device types. So just disregard everything I've just told you, because in my opinion, if you're working for a particular brand or a particular group of brands, an agency, there's not really much you can do with aggregated cookie rejection information, because what you really care about is how it's impacting your measurement and your personalization strategies yourselves. So this shows anonymized data at the client level now. All that you've got there is the vertical the client's in, and these are all US clients of ours. None of these are in the UK. And I'm going to show you three, and it's going to be an illustration of why aggregated data isn't very helpful when you're looking at your own data sets. So the first one is a retail brand. And it's a retail brand that uses us plus a DSP instead of a one-stop shop retargeting solution, something like Criteo. They just use us plus a DSP. So cookie rejection for them is tiny. Why is that? Well, the DSP is not going to be able to buy people programmatically who don't have cookies who've visited their client site. So if you're doing just a retargeting strategy, you're going to inherently buy away from cookie rejectors. You could think that's fine, that's no problem, then I can carry on looking at my data sets and everything. I mean, that's true to a degree, but anyone that read the bid switch paper that came out last week will know that eCPMs are double for matched impressions programmatically now than unmatched ones, because what you've got is everyone chasing this ever shrinking pool of inventory for people with long life cookies. So while it might seem okay now, longer term, chasing long life cookies isn't going to be a viable strategy moving forward. And the other one I want to just highlight is the auto example. This is an auto client of ours who does a lot of site direct buys with premium publishers. Their cookie rejection is huge. Now, the reason for that, if you're implementing something like header bidding as a publisher, which makes complete sense, that allows you to manage your yield much better. You can offer impressions programmatically before the publisher ad server has to make a decision about what tag to call. So what's happening? Inventory you can sell programmatically is being sold programmatically, and the inventory that's less desirable is being used to fulfill the site direct buys. That's not necessarily a problem. You might be getting loads of Safari inventory, which is great audience. People on Apple devices might have econometrically speaking, a closer connection to your brand and all that. The problem is if you're then being asked to justify your media spend through cookie metrics, such as site visits, you're not going to be able to prove that many people visited your client's site, your auto site, after seeing ads, because you've got no cookies to make that connection. I'm conscious for time here, so I'm going to pick things up a little bit. So the big four web browsers have all gone in different directions in terms of cookie rejection. They've all taken different approaches. Safari's ITP is something they've built from the ground up. via WebKit, which is their browser engine. And they've built on top of the first iterations of ITP. And we're now up to ITP 2.3, I believe, which has been pretty effective in completely curtailing cross-domain cookies. And it's also been pretty effective at limiting the usefulness of first-party cookies over a longer time period. Firefox, their ETP policy's got the least attention. I think it's personally the most controversial. They've employed a third party, a company called Disconnect, to maintain effectively a block list for them of companies that this third party consider to be setting cookies, fingerprinting, etc. So they've kind of passed that on to a third party to manage, but it's on by default. So we see incredibly high instances of cookie blocking in Firefox. And the final one, Chrome. Obviously, Chrome have made their announcements that in 2 years they're going to end all support for third-party cookies. It's important to know the context when we're looking at the browsers penetration. So obviously, Chrome is really the market leader. If you're talking about the open web desktop world, Chrome, the lion's share of impressions. Safari really changes quite profoundly by geo. So in America and Europe, we see a much higher instances of Safari, which is probably a reflection of the devices people are using in those markets. So if we look at what cookie rejection looks like in Q1, it's pretty staggering. 45% we're seeing now, and this is before Chrome changes, cookie rejection in Q1 of this year. I've given the game away for the third question. It was going to be what's cookie rejection like in Chrome right now, and we're seeing it at 7%. So the reason I included that is that's basically what's keeping the current ecosystem going in terms of cookie harvesting, ID matching, and all these things. It's Chrome inventory. So when that goes away, we're really going to have made sure that we come up with some solutions. So we see, if you look at the policy, so the Firefox policy has been pretty effective at blocking cookies. Safari 92%, so only 8% of Safari users are persisting third-party cookies. So you can see the policies that have implemented have been effective. We didn't mention the Microsoft browsers, so they're the only really big browser family that isn't doing any kind of cookie blocking by default, other than Chrome. And we see that cookie rejection is around between 9 and 13% for their main browsers. So that gives you a rough indication of the number of people that go in and change their browser settings. Cookies rejected, interesting one. So remember this metric from earlier in the presentation. The cookies that are being rejected, this is when it gets really interesting, because you see that in the browsers where there's high cookie rejection, they're absolutely burning through the cookies. You've got very few long life cookies. What you've got is millions and millions of one and done cookies. Look at all those 99%. That's what that's telling you. So I tried to come up with some takeaways. So the 4 takeaways I think are really important are, we've already passed the point at which third-party cookies offer a fair view of media performance because there's inherent bias in the data based on whether the media you're running supports cookies or not. And despite this, I would say in my experience, and I'd love to hear other people's, cookie harvesting is still the default metric for performance marketing. So using cookies for targeting and then harvesting the IDs to measure performance is still probably the default solution. So as we heard earlier from BidSwitch, eCPMs are 2x higher for cookie maxed impressions, meaning that brands are still going after this ever decreasing pool of inventory, which is increasing demand. And really now's the time to investigate alternative forms of targeting and measurement. And I created an incredibly corny phrase to end with. We've already hit the iceberg, we just haven't sunk yet. And apologies, I'm a couple of minutes over. I'm going to hand it back over to Dom at the IAB, I think is going to wrap things up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Dom. Really interesting. It's great to see. I think also just to kind of highlight, there's a lot of work that the IAB is doing on user identity as well. So again, keep in touch with what we're doing. Just want to quickly thank everyone for their presentations, and obviously thanks to our sponsors at UConn. We'll be having the second session coming up next Tuesday. Elizabeth, our head of research, will be hosting that, so great to be missing me. And again, Julie will be following up the second part of her COVID-19 updates. Just as a heads up, we're going to be getting a talk from Behave, who are looking at how they're applying new research techniques to generate growth on TikTok. And that Bible will be updating you guys on young people and their spending habits as well. If I can shout back to you guys to make sure that you leave feedback by clicking on the link in the chat, that would be fantastic. And just to confirm, I think Joanna's just left a message saying would the slides be shared. Yeah, I need to just double check on the availability for some of the UConn data from Julie, but we will be following up with all the attendees and be able to share the slides shortly after that. So we just want to see if there's any other questions coming through from the list. I think that's it so far. Yes, by the looks of things that is. But if you have any other questions, then obviously you can just drop us a line. I'm Dominic at iabuk.com. But hopefully we will see you for part 2 next week. If you have any other questions, then do let us know. Keep safe, and we will see you very, very soon. Thanks very much indeed. Bye-bye.